They say it starts with a knock. Just 3 slow, deliberate raps on your door in the dead of night. You don't see anyone when you check, but something always gets left behind. For her, it was a baby monitor. No note, no explanation, just the faint glow of its power light, and the sound of ragged, uneven breathing coming through the speaker. At first she thought it was a cruel joke, but as the nights dragged on, the breathing grew louder, closer, until one night it wasn't coming from the monitor anymore. It was coming from her own closet. The knocking started at 11:47 p.m. It was soft at first, so quiet it could have been mistaken for the house settling or the branches scratching against the siding in the wind. But then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that sent vibrations through the doorframe. She sat up on the couch, blanket pooling at her waist, and stared across the dark living room toward the front door. Her phone sat on the coffee table, its screen glowing faintly with unread notifications, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she held her breath, straining her ears. Nothing moved. No footsteps on the porch. No shuffling retreat down the steps. Just silence so complete, it seemed to press against her eardrums. Then, after a long pause, the knocks came again. Louder this time. More patient. She didn't stand. She didn't call out. Instead, she slid her hand over to her phone and turned off the screen. The soft glow vanished, leaving her in shadow. Every muscle in her body felt wound tight, her skin prickling like she'd stepped into a cold wind. She whispered to herself, words meant to reassure, though they came out too thin to be convincing. It's probably nothing. Maybe a neighbor, maybe. Another 3 knocks cut her off. She flinched violently, the sound so close it felt like it had come from inside the house. Her gaze darted to the front door again, where a faint rectangle of light from the porch lamp stretched across the floor. The door stayed still. The knob didn't turn, but something in her gut twisted with the certainty that someone or something was waiting on the other side. She rose slowly, every floorboard creak magnified in the silence. Her socks whispered against the hardwood as she crept toward the door. She kept her breathing shallow, afraid that even the sound of her exhale would give her away. When she was close enough to touch the knob, she paused, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it would give her position away. Carefully, she leaned forward and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, slick with rain from earlier. The streetlights glowed dully in the mist beyond the lawn. No car engines idled nearby. No shadows moved on the sidewalk. She let out a slow breath, tension bleeding from her shoulders. Maybe it had been the wind after all. She stepped back from the door and nearly screamed as her phone buzzed violently in her hand. She glanced down, an unknown number flashing on the screen. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button. The screen timed out and went dark before she could decide. She swallowed hard and slipped the phone into her pocket, retreating to the couch. But just as she sat down, the knocks came again. This time, softer, almost gentle. 3 raps spaced perfectly apart. She pressed her hands to her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. When she opened them again, the house was still quiet, but her chest felt tight, her lungs refusing to fill properly. She told herself she wouldn't check again. She wouldn't give in to the curiosity curling in her stomach like a live wire. Minutes passed, maybe hours. At some point, she drifted into a fitful sleep, still curled on the couch with the blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. The sound of knocking followed her into her dreams, slow, deliberate. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the walls. She woke with a start, heart pounding, and sat upright. The house was silent again. No knocks, no footsteps, nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain against the roof. She glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. She had no memory of falling asleep. She stood and padded toward the staircase, rubbing at her eyes. Maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. Stress from work, lack of sleep. It all added up. But as she reached the base of the stairs, something caught her eye. A faint shadow moved across the bottom of the front door. It shifted once, then disappeared, like someone stepping away from the porch light. She froze, her pulse spiked, her throat closing up. Slowly, she backed toward the kitchen, her eyes locked on the door, as though expecting it to burst open at any second. She grabbed her phone from the counter, her fingers fumbling as she dialed for help. But before she pressed the call button, she noticed something odd outside the door. There was a small box sitting neatly on the welcome mat. She didn't move for what felt like forever. The box sat there on the mat, perfectly centered, as if placed with care. It was small, barely larger than a loaf of bread, and unmarked. No name, no delivery label, no tape, just a plain nondescript box collecting droplets of mist under the porch light. Her fingers tightened around her phone until her knuckles ached. She thought about calling someone, anyone, but stopped herself. What would she even say? That someone knocked 3 times and left a box? It sounded ridiculous, even in her own head. Still, a cold unease coiled in her stomach, growing tighter with every second she stared at that small, quiet package. She thought of leaving it there, pretending she hadn't seen it. But the idea of ignoring it felt worse somehow, like turning her back on something dangerous, lurking just out of sight. Slowly, she reached for the deadbolt and turned it, flinching as the metal clicked too loudly in the stillness. She opened the door a fraction and leaned out. The air was sharp with rain and the earthy scent of wet leaves. She scanned the empty street again. No figures, no parked cars she didn't recognize, just her quiet neighborhood wrapped in fog. She crouched down and hesitated, hand hovering over the box. It was heavier than she expected when she finally picked it up. The cardboard felt slightly damp, the weight inside shifting faintly, as though packed with something solid and unyielding. She carried it back inside and locked the door, flipping the deadbolt and sliding the chain across for good measure. The box made a dull thump as she set it down on the kitchen counter. She stared at it for a long moment, waiting, though for what, she didn't know. Nothing happened. No noises, no strange vibrations, just a quiet box under the pale glow of her kitchen light. Finally, with trembling hands, she found a pair of scissors and sliced carefully along the seam. The flaps popped open with a soft rustle. Inside was a baby monitor, modern, sleek, its small screen dark but a faint green light, blinking steadily on its side. She frowned and pulled it out, turning it over in her hands. No instructions, no charging cable, just the monitor itself and a coiled power cord tucked beneath. A nervous laugh escaped her lips, short and humorless. This had to be some kind of mistake. She didn't have children. She didn't even know anyone with a baby close enough to prank her like this. She set the monitor down on the counter and backed away. Maybe it was a wrong delivery. Maybe one of her neighbors would come knocking in the morning to collect it. But as she turned to leave the kitchen, The monitor's screen flickered faintly to life. A hiss of static rose from the small speaker, breaking the silence like a needle dragging across a record. She froze, her head whipping around. At first she thought she imagined it. The faint sound that followed was so quiet, it could have been the wind sighing through a crack in the window. But then it came again. Long, ragged, uneven breaths. Someone was breathing into the monitor. The sound was wet and strained, like each inhale scraped against a raw throat. She felt her skin crawl, goosebumps prickling across her arms. "No," she whispered, voice barely audible over the static. She stepped closer, heart pounding as the breathing grew louder. Her trembling fingers reached for the power button, but she stopped short. What if she turned it off, and the sound didn't stop? What if it wasn't coming from the monitor at all? The thought rooted her feet to the floor, a cold wave of realization washing over her. She swallowed hard and forced herself to speak, her voice quivering. "Who's there?" The breathing paused. The static hissed louder in the silence that followed, filling the kitchen like a swarm of insects. And then, so faint, she almost missed it. There was a sound like a soft scrape, something shifting against wood, from upstairs. She didn't move, couldn't move. The sound of that faint scrape from upstairs sank into her bones like ice water. It wasn't loud, not enough to dismiss as furniture settling or pipes creaking, but subtle, deliberate, something shifting against wood. The baby monitor in her hand hissed with static, and the breathing resumed, heavier now, each inhale rattling, as if through damaged lungs. She tightened her grip on the monitor, knuckles whitening, every muscle in her body screaming to run. But her feet stayed rooted to the kitchen tile, her eyes locked on the dark stairwell that led up to her bedroom. She whispered again, louder this time, though her voice broke in the middle. "Who's there?" Silence answered her. The breathing on the monitor slowed, almost thoughtful, and then a new sound joined it, a faint thud, like a hand knocking gently on wood. 3 slow taps, perfectly spaced. She flinched hard enough to drop the monitor. It hit the floor with a clatter, the screen cracking but staying lit. The ragged breaths kept coming, now distorted by the damaged speaker. She backed away from it, her pulse roaring in her ears. The air in the kitchen felt heavier with each passing second, pressing in on her chest until every breath felt like a struggle. She forced herself to grab her phone from her pocket, fumbling to unlock it. Her thumb hovered over the emergency call button, but she stopped. What would she tell them? That a stranger left a baby monitor on her porch, and now she was hearing breathing from upstairs. They'd think she was losing her mind. Her eyes darted back to the stairwell. She needed proof. That was the thought that anchored her trembling hands and stopped her from dialing. If she could find out what, if anything, was up there, she could call the police and have them take her seriously. She swallowed hard and snatched a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The beam shook wildly in her grip as she aimed it toward the stairs. "This is stupid," she muttered under her breath. But the words didn't help. Each step creaked under her weight as she climbed slowly, straining her ears for any hint of movement. Halfway up, she paused and listened. The house was still, so quiet that the faint hum of electricity in the walls seemed deafening. She reached the top landing and swept the flashlight beam across the hallway. Bedroom door closed, bathroom door open, guest room dark and still. She edged toward her bedroom, each step deliberate, her bare feet brushing softly against the carpet. She stopped just outside the door, heart hammering so violently she felt dizzy. The door was slightly ajar, though she could have sworn she closed it earlier. A sliver of darkness stared back at her like a waiting eye. She pressed her palm flat against the wood and pushed. The door swung inward with an audible groan. She aimed the flashlight inside. Nothing moved. Her bed was undisturbed, the covers still neatly folded from that morning. She stepped inside, keeping her back against the wall as her light roamed the room. Her dresser, her nightstand, the small chair in the corner piled with clothes. Everything seemed normal, except for the closet door. It was open just a crack, barely enough for her to catch a glimpse of darkness inside. She licked her dry lips, her breath coming faster now, and took a step closer. The flashlight beam trembled over the door frame, catching the edge of the handle. She reached out with her free hand, fingers brushing against the cold metal knob. She hesitated, frozen in place, as a new sound emerged from the baby monitor downstairs. 3 slow knocks, not from her closet, from the front door. Her breath hitched. The sound of knocking echoed faintly from downstairs. 3 slow, deliberate taps against the front door. The same pattern, the same unhurried rhythm that had started it all. She froze, torn between the threat upstairs and the one below. The baby monitor crackled from the kitchen, the ragged breathing still spilling through its damaged speaker. The sound sent shivers crawling up her spine. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, eyes flicking back to the closet door. It remained slightly ajar, darkness pooling within like ink bleeding across paper. She couldn't help imagining what might be crouched inside, unseen, waiting for her to step closer. The knocking downstairs repeated, louder now. Each thud reverberated through the floorboards beneath her bare feet. She wanted to run down the stairs, out the door, anywhere, but her body refused to move, rooted by a primal dread that warned her, don't turn your back on the closet. She inched closer, the flashlight trembling wildly in her hands. The beam flickered over the gap between the door and the frame, and for a moment she thought she saw movement, a shift in the shadows, like someone adjusting their weight. She stopped, breathing, heart hammering so loud she was sure whoever or whatever was inside could hear it. Then it happened, a sound so subtle yet unmistakable, it made her blood run cold. A shallow, raspy inhale, followed by an even slower exhale. Breathing, coming from the closet. Not through the monitor this time. This was real. This was here. Her stomach knotted, nausea clawing at her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she couldn't bring herself to turn away. If she looked away, it would come out. She was certain of it. She raised her voice, though it quivered with fear. Who's in there? Silence. For a moment she dared to hope she'd imagined it. But then the breathing resumed, louder now, wet and uneven like lungs struggling to pull in air. Her fingers tightened on the knob, slick with sweat. She swallowed hard and yanked the door open, flashlight cutting into the black. Empty. Her closet was empty. Her dresses hung motionless, shoes lined neatly along the floor. Nothing crouched among the shadows. The breathing was gone. She let out a shaky breath, relief and confusion tangling in her chest. Had she really heard it, or had her mind been playing tricks on her? She took a step back, lowering the flashlight, but then her eyes caught something she'd missed before. A faint scuff mark on the wooden floorboards, just inside the closet door, as if something or someone had been standing there recently. Before she could investigate further, a new sound made her spin toward the hallway. The baby monitor's speaker hissed louder, the static now joined by soft, irregular thuds. The knocks were no longer at the front door. They were coming from the base of the stairs. She backed away from the closet, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The thuds grew louder, closer. It wasn't frantic pounding, no urgency, just slow, patient knocks climbing one step at a time. She could almost picture a hand, pale and deliberate, pressing against the wood with each movement upward. A voice whispered through the monitor, faint, male, low. She couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was wrong, like it was speaking through broken teeth. The knocks reached the top of the stairs. She pressed herself against the wall, panic clawing at her chest. Then silence. The house fell utterly still. She held her breath, ears straining. No knocks, no breathing, only the distant hum of the monitor downstairs, and then 3 slow, deliberate raps. This time, they came from behind her, from inside the closet. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there, pressed against the bathroom door with her knees pulled so tight to her chest. It hurt to breathe. The tile beneath her felt like ice. But the sweat pouring down her back clung in clammy rivulets that made her shiver. Outside, the house was too quiet, an unnatural stillness that left her straining to hear past the roaring in her own ears. The footsteps had stopped, but she couldn't shake the memory of their slow, deliberate rhythm, each creak of the floorboards as heavy as a heartbeat, as patient as a predator circling its prey. Her phone lay useless on the bathroom counter. The screen cracked from when she dropped it in her scramble to escape. She had no desire to call anyone now, not because she didn't need help, but because she couldn't bear to break the silence. Speaking would mean acknowledging that something had entered her home, and some deep, primal part of her warned that acknowledgement might give it permission to come closer. She had locked the bathroom door, yes, but she wasn't naive enough to believe that would stop anything determined to get in. The lock was flimsy, meant to keep out pets or children, not intruders. Not the kind of thing she now imagined, standing motionless just beyond her fragile barrier. Her breathing stuttered, catching in her throat as she pressed her palm against the door, feeling the cool wood vibrate faintly. Was that her pulse echoing, or a sound from the other side? The baby monitor's hiss snapped her head up, sharp as a knife in the quiet. At first, it was the familiar crackle of static, but then the breathing started again, slow, ragged, wet, the sound of someone forcing air through lungs that didn't quite work right. But there was something new now, under the breath's whispering. It was faint, like someone murmuring to themselves in the dark, just beyond her comprehension. She strained to listen, the syllables slippery and alien, but there was no mistaking the cadence. It wasn't a language she recognized, more a string of guttural sounds, almost like chanting. The words came in a broken rhythm, halting and sickly sweet, as if whoever spoke them was trying to coax something closer. Her stomach knotted so tight, it hurt. She wanted to believe it was interference, some freak accident of radio waves catching a neighbor's conversation. But deep down, she already knew the truth. This wasn't random. The monitor wasn't picking up a signal by chance. This was directed at her. Each whispered word seemed to curl beneath the door, wrapping around her ankles like invisible tendrils, tugging gently but insistently. She clamped her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut, rocking back and forth in a pathetic attempt to block it out. But even through the muffling pressure of her palms, the sound seeped in, soft and persistent. She tried to remember how she had ended up here, hiding in her own bathroom like a child terrified of the dark. It all blurred together now. The knocks at the door, the box, the monitor, The memory of finding that plain cardboard package on her porch made her stomach turn. She hadn't wanted to open it. Some part of her had screamed to leave it alone, to call someone else and let them deal with it. But curiosity had won. It always did. She'd carried it inside like it was nothing, not knowing what she was inviting in. Even now, she couldn't understand why a baby monitor would be left for her. Of all people, she had no children. She lived alone, no friends, no family nearby to leave such a thing as a gift. The memory of the monitor's green power light blinking at her from the kitchen counter felt burned into her mind. So innocuous, so ordinary, and yet from the moment she saw it, the house hadn't felt safe. She wondered fleetingly if it had been left to watch her or to make her watch something else. Either possibility left her feeling hollow. The footsteps started again. She tensed, fingers digging into her knees as she strained to listen. The sound was soft this time, almost cautious. A single step, then a pause. Another step. Each movement came with a faint creak of the floorboards, and she imagined the weight behind them, deliberate, unhurried. They were coming closer. She could hear them now at the base of the stairs, and she knew without seeing that whoever or whatever it was had stopped there listening for her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed both hands over her mouth to smother it. A small sob threatened to break free, but she swallowed it down, her chest aching with the effort. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, and she began to wonder if it was still there, or if it had moved on. But then she heard it, a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging lightly against wood. It wasn't coming from the stairs anymore. It was coming from the door. Her door. She clamped a hand over her mouth, choking back a whimper as her eyes darted to the lock. The thin metal latch seemed laughably inadequate now, a mere suggestion of security. The scraping stopped, and for one blessed moment, she thought it had gone. But then came a soft, deliberate knock. 3 raps, perfectly spaced, each one sending a shockwave through her bones. She froze, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Another knock followed, a little louder this time. The sound vibrated through the wood beneath her back, a sickening reminder of just how thin the barrier was. She could almost imagine a hand on the other side, pale, emaciated fingers curling against the panel. A third knock came, heavier now. Her body trembled violently, her heart beat so fast she thought she might pass out. Then silence again, no footsteps retreating, no breathing through the door, just oppressive, crushing silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. She stayed that way for what felt like hours, every nerve in her body straining toward the faintest sound. Her phone lay within arm's reach on the counter, but the thought of calling for help felt both foolish and impossible. What would she say? That she was being haunted by knocks and whispers on a baby monitor. They'd send a wellness check at best, too late to do anything. At worst, they'd dismiss her entirely. She blinked hard, fighting tears that threatened to spill over. She couldn't sit there forever. Sooner or later, she would have to move. Sooner or later, it would grow impatient. And then from somewhere deep inside the house, she heard the sound that made her blood run cold. The monitor's speaker crackled and popped. Then a man's voice, low and guttural, spoke her name.
For a moment, she wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly. The voice had been so low, almost swallowed by static, but there was no denying the sound. Her name, spoken in a rasping whisper that twisted her stomach and made her skin prickle. It didn't sound like anyone she knew. The syllables dragged out too long, the consonants harsh and wet, as though the speaker's mouth was full of water or blood. She pressed her hands tighter over her ears, trying to block out the hiss of the monitor, but she could still hear it, faint and insistent. Her name again. This time a little louder, each syllable stretched like someone savoring it. Then the voice shifted, speaking words she didn't understand, the tone rising and falling in a sick rhythm. The cadence was almost hypnotic, pulling at her mind like a tide. She clenched her teeth and dug her nails into her knees until she felt them bite through skin. Anything to anchor herself in the now. She couldn't let it pull her in. She couldn't, and yet, no matter how hard she tried to shut it out, the voice continued. Not angry, not demanding, just patient, as though it had all the time in the world to wait for her to listen. Then came the knocking again. 3 sharp raps against the bathroom door. She jerked her head up, her chest tightening so hard it hurt. Her name whispered once more through the monitor. This time it was right behind her ear. She nearly screamed but slammed both hands over her mouth to muffle the sound. The knocks repeated, 3 measured taps that made the wood vibrate under her back. They weren't loud, not frantic or violent, but their restraint was worse somehow. Whoever, or whatever, stood on the other side, wasn't trying to break in. It was waiting for her to open the door. The thought made her stomach churn with nausea. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping the silence would stretch out, but her mind betrayed her, filling the stillness with the image of pale, skeletal fingers brushing against the handle. She could almost hear them scratching faintly, testing the lock with unnatural patience. The baby monitor's static deepened into a low humming tone, almost like a growl, rumbling from some distant throat. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. One wrong sound, and she knew the knocking would change. It would grow louder, more violent. It would come in, time blurred. She didn't know how long she sat like that, every muscle screaming in protest, her body shaking violently from the cold sweat, soaking her clothes. The monitor whispered her name again, dragging the syllables out so far they became grotesque. Her chest burned with each shallow breath. She allowed herself. Her mind raced through possible escapes. Crawl out the bathroom window, scream for help, make a run for the stairs. But each option felt like a death sentence. Her eyes darted to the narrow bathroom window above the tub. It was small, but maybe. She dismissed the thought instantly. Climbing out would mean turning her back to the door, and every instinct she had screamed against that idea. She stared at the crack under the door instead, waiting for a shadow to pass across it, for a finger to curl through. But nothing came. The only movement was her own trembling reflection in the bathroom mirror, across from her. She looked hollow, pale, her lips cracked from holding her breath too long. Then came the sound of something moving down the hall. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. The sound was slow, scraping and stopping intermittently, as if whatever made it was too weak to lift its burden. She felt bile rise in her throat, clamping a hand over her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. It was coming closer. She could hear it now near the bathroom door, the scrape of wood against wood pausing just outside. The breathing on the monitor grew louder, synced perfectly with the dragging sound. She didn't know if it was real anymore, or if her mind had merged the two into one horrible presence. A faint thump made her flinch, a weight resting against the door. She could almost feel it there, pressing gently, testing her resolve. Her name rasped again, low and guttural, as if whispered through cracked, bleeding lips. And then came the smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Rot, damp earth and sour decay, seeping under the door like a warning. Her stomach twisted violently, her gag reflex nearly overpowering her. She clamped both hands over her mouth, biting down on her knuckles to keep quiet. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears, so loud she was certain it would betray her. The dragging sound stopped. The bathroom door creaked softly, a shift in weight pressing against it. Her eyes locked on the handle, watching as it trembled, just slightly, as though someone's fingers brushed against it. Her mind screamed at her to move, to do something, but her body refused to listen. Her voice had fled entirely. She was a statue now, a silent witness to her own undoing. The monitor hissed one final time, then went dead. The silence that followed was worse than any sound.
The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like a heavy shroud. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. Her body ached from the tension, muscles locked so tight they felt ready to snap. The bathroom door remained still, but the faint scent of rot lingered in the air, stronger now, sickly sweet, and clinging to the back of her throat. Her eyes never left the doorknob. It had stopped trembling, but she couldn't shake the image of pale, cracked fingers resting on the other side, waiting for her to make a sound. The quiet pressed in closer, unnatural in its weight. No creaks, no shuffling, no whispering from the monitor. It was as if the house itself had gone still, holding its breath alongside her. Somewhere deep inside, she wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had been stalking her had gone, but instinct screamed otherwise. She was not alone. It was still there, watching, waiting. She clenched her teeth so hard. Her jaw ached, tears streaking silently down her face as she willed herself not to sob, not to give it any reason to know she was still breathing. Then, softly, the sound of footsteps returned. This time they were different, lighter, quicker, as though whatever had been dragging itself moments ago had regained some measure of strength. The steps moved away from the bathroom, down the hall, their rhythm steady and unhurried. Relief and dread warred in her chest. Was it leaving, or just circling, repositioning for something worse? Her ears strained, tracking every creak and groan of the floorboards beyond her thin sanctuary. She let her hands slide down to grip the edge of the cold tile beneath her thighs, fingers digging into the grout. She needed a plan. She couldn't stay here forever. At some point she would have to move, and when she did, she had to be ready. Her eyes darted again to the small window above the tub. Could she fit? Would the drop be survivable? She doubted it, but the thought of staying in this box a second longer felt unbearable. The footsteps had stopped again, and the house returned to silence. But this silence felt expectant. A new sound rose from below. The monitor, long dead, emitted a faint, distorted hum. It was low at first, barely noticeable, but it grew steadily louder, rising in pitch, until it became an ear-splitting whine. She flinched, clapping her hands over her ears. The sound felt alive, vibrating the tiles under her. Her teeth rattled with it. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the whine cut out. The house plunged back into silence, but the air felt heavier now, charged with static electricity. The hairs on her arms stood on end. Her breath came faster, despite her efforts to control it. She pressed her back tighter against the door, closing her eyes and praying. She hadn't prayed in years, but now her whispered words came fast and desperate. "Please, please leave me alone. Please don't open the door." The reply came instantly. 3 slow knocks against the wood behind her head.
Her body convulsed in terror, every nerve alight with electric panic. She couldn't stop the sob that broke loose, her hands flying up to stifle it. Too late. The knocks came again, harder this time, rattling the frame. She pressed her hands flat against the door, as if she could hold it closed with sheer willpower. Her mind screamed at her to move, to get out, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was trapped in her own fear, paralyzed. The smell of rot thickened, filling her nostrils with its putrid sweetness. The doorknob twisted slightly, a faint metallic creak that made her stomach clench. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All she could do was listen to that sound, to the patient turning of metal as something tested the strength of the lock. And then it stopped. The pressure against the door lifted. The smell faded slightly. She waited, heart hammering for the next knock, but none came. Cautiously, she lowered her hands from the door, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She told herself she had to get up, had to move before it came back. Her body finally obeyed, and she pushed herself to her feet, gripping the counter for balance. Her legs trembled violently beneath her weight, threatening to give out. She glanced toward the window again, her only escape, but as she stepped toward it, her foot caught on something hard. She looked down. The baby monitor was on the floor. She hadn't heard it being placed there. She hadn't seen it slide under the door, but there it was, cracked screen glowing faintly in the dim light, its speaker emitting a faint hiss. A new sound emerged, breathing again, but this time it wasn't wet or ragged. It was calm, measured, and it was in perfect sync with her own.
She stared down at the baby monitor, her breath hitching in her chest. The faint glow from its cracked screen pulsed like a heartbeat, weak but insistent. The sound of breathing filled the tiny bathroom, soft and steady, her own breaths perfectly mirrored, perfectly timed. She stepped back, one trembling foot at a time, her heel pressing against the cold porcelain of the tub. Her eyes darted toward the window again. If she could just climb out, just get her feet on the ground outside, she could run for help. But her gut twisted violently at the thought. Somehow she knew that moving toward the window would be the wrong choice, that it was waiting for her to make that mistake. Her mind screamed at her to act anyway, to do anything but stand frozen while the thing outside planned its next move. She wiped at the sweat streaking her forehead, fingers shaking so badly, she almost dropped the flashlight still clutched in her hand. The monitor crackled suddenly, a burst of static that made her flinch. The breathing stopped. For one suspended moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then came a faint voice through the speaker. "I'm inside." Her body went rigid, blood draining from her face so fast, she felt lightheaded. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was an edge beneath it, an undercurrent of malice, so thick it made her stomach churn. She pressed herself tighter against the tub, gripping the rim until her fingers hurt. She could hear it now, faint movement beyond the bathroom door. Not the slow, deliberate footsteps from before, but a soft scuttling sound, low to the ground, like hands and feet crawling across the floor. The image bloomed in her mind, unbidden, something pale and twisted, its limbs too long, dragging itself toward her, on all fours with that same unnatural patience. Her breath quickened, fogging the air. The scuttling stopped. Silence fell once more, oppressive and heavy. Her ears strained against it, desperate for any hint of where it had gone. Then, from the monitor, the voice whispered again, "Look behind you." Her stomach dropped as icy terror gripped her spine. She didn't want to turn. Every cell in her body screamed against it. But the words crawled into her mind,
like a command she couldn't resist. Slowly, with agonizing reluctance, she shifted her gaze to the mirror across the bathroom. For a heartbeat, all she saw was her own pale, wide-eyed reflection, shaking so badly she barely recognized herself. Then, as if emerging from the shadows themselves, something moved behind her in the glass. A pale shape in the corner of the room, low to the floor, its edges indistinct but undeniably there. She spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the air in a frantic arc. Nothing, just the damp towels on the rack, the cracked tiles, the faint smell of mold. But her heart knew better. It had been there, she had seen it. She wasn't alone. The monitor hissed louder now, static building in sharp waves, until it was almost a scream. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. The lights flickered violently, casting the small bathroom into brief staccato flashes of light and shadow. In one flicker, she saw nothing. In the next, there was a pale hand curling around the edge of the doorframe from the hallway outside. Her stomach heaved, and she swallowed back bile. Another flicker, nothing. Another, and the hand had moved lower. Long fingers splayed unnaturally wide, as if preparing to crawl. Then, the door creaked. The sound was soft but final, the latch giving way as the handle began to turn slowly. Her legs finally unlocked from their paralysis, and she lunged toward the window, her movements clumsy and desperate. The sound of the door opening followed her, louder than the blood roaring in her ears. She scrambled onto the edge of the tub, fingers fumbling with the latch of the small window. It stuck at first, swollen from moisture and years of disuse. She sobbed in frustration, slamming her palm against it until it budged with a groan. She shoved the glass upward and grabbed for the frame, preparing to pull herself through. But the monitor spoke again, too late. A cold hand closed around her ankle. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat raw and unrestrained as she kicked out wildly. The grip was impossibly strong, fingers like iron digging into her flesh. She felt herself being pulled down from the tub, her nails scraping deep gouges into the porcelain as she tried to hold on. Her flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning until its beam caught something. An impossibly long, pale arm stretching from the open door, thin as bone, but impossibly strong. She kicked again, heel connecting with something that made a sickening crack. The grip loosened just enough for her to wrench free. She clambered onto the windowsill, forcing her body through the narrow opening, the wood scraping painfully against her ribs. She didn't dare look back. Her body tumbled onto the wet grass outside, the night air cold and sharp in her lungs. She hit the ground hard, rolling onto her side with a muffled cry of pain. Behind her, the bathroom window slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass. The house loomed above her, silent once more, its windows dark and unwelcoming. She scrambled to her feet, bare soles stinging against the gravel path as she sprinted toward the street. Her breaths came in ragged sobs, her legs screaming with each frantic step. She didn't stop, not when she reached the neighbor's yard, not when she saw the faint glow of streetlights ahead, not even when her lungs burned so badly she thought they might tear open. Because behind her, faint but undeniable, came the sound of 3 slow knocks. She didn't stop running, not even when her breath came in short, stabbing gasps, or when her bare feet tore open on the broken asphalt. The street ahead, blurred as tears stung her eyes, the houses on either side, looming like empty mausoleums. No lights turned on, no curious neighbors peeked from behind curtains. The world was still asleep, deaf to her panic. Her heart pounded so loudly, she couldn't tell whether the sound behind her was footsteps or just the echo of her own terror. She didn't dare look back. The knocks had followed her out of the house, but the silence that replaced them had been worse. Like whatever it was had decided to leave the comfort of shadow for something far more intimate. Her legs burned with exertion as she stumbled up a neighbor's porch and slammed her fist into the door. "Please," she cried, voice cracked and raw. "Please, open up." But no one came. Not a flicker of motion behind the windows. No bark from a dog. No porch light illuminating her bloodied face. The street remained frozen, as though the entire block was holding its breath. Behind her, the night thickened. The shadows felt closer, heavier. She turned her face to the peephole in the door and whispered one more plea. "It's in my house," she said, "and it followed me here." Still no answer. She stepped back from the door, her legs shaking, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Blood dripped from her heel, pooling on the welcome mat. She looked around the quiet street, shivering despite the warm summer air. It felt wrong, all of it. The street had never been this silent before. She had lived here for nearly 4 years. She knew the sounds of her neighborhood, the whirring of sprinklers, the distant hum of cars, the occasional laughter from a backyard gathering. But tonight, there was nothing, not even the crickets. The silence was total, unnatural. She took another step back, eyes darting to every window. Every house stared blankly back at her. "Why won't anyone come?" she whispered. But the night swallowed her voice, and then, in the distance, she heard it again. 3 knocks, not loud, not urgent, but clear. She turned sharply, scanning the shadows between the houses. The knocks came again, this time from a different direction. Closer, her hands trembled as she backed toward the sidewalk. Something was moving, but not fast. It didn't have to. It knew where she was. She ran again. Her destination wasn't clear, only a way. Her home, once a sanctuary, had betrayed her. The neighbors wouldn't open their doors. The streetlights flickered overhead as she darted from shadow to shadow, barely keeping her balance. Somewhere deep inside, she wondered if she'd already crossed some invisible threshold. If whatever had followed her out had taken more than just her safety, had taken the rules. Her world no longer felt anchored in reason. She spotted a gas station glowing like a beacon a block away. The sight gave her the illusion of hope, something to run toward instead of from. She didn't stop to think. She didn't let herself believe it could be a trap. She just ran. As she reached the door, it opened with a sharp chime. The familiar fluorescent lighting flooded over her, and for a moment she could breathe. A bored-looking attendant behind the counter blinked at her in surprise. "Jesus," he said, "are you okay?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. She hadn't realized how badly she was shaking. He stepped around the counter, hands raised like he might catch her. Hey, sit down," he said. "You're bleeding. What happened?" But she couldn't speak, couldn't explain. The monitor, the knocks, the voice. How do you explain a nightmare that follows you through locked doors? She sat down slowly on the cold tile floor, back against a rack of candy bars. The clerk disappeared behind the counter again, fumbling with a phone. "I'm calling someone," he said. "You need a hospital or a cop or something." She nodded, barely hearing him. The buzz of the store lights filled her ears. She felt untethered, floating just above herself. Her vision narrowed, tunnel-like. The adrenaline had carried her this far, but it was draining fast. The thought of going back outside made her chest tighten. She closed her eyes. Breathe, just breathe, and then another chime at the door. She flinched, eyes snapping open. A man stepped inside. He was tall, wearing a long black coat, despite the warmth. His face was obscured beneath the shadow of a wide hood. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the clerk. He simply walked to the back of the store and stood still, so still it looked wrong. The clerk stopped talking mid-sentence, the phone still to his ear. No response. The man didn't move, didn't breathe. He stood in front of the refrigerated drinks, like he was waiting. The clerk stepped forward. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" Still no answer. Something about the man's stillness made her stomach twist. It was like looking at a mannequin pretending to be human. She rose slowly, each movement deliberate, her eyes never leaving the dark figure. "Don't go near him," she whispered. The clerk shot her a confused glance. She didn't repeat herself. She couldn't. She was too focused on the way the man's head tilted, just slightly, as if reacting to her voice. The clerk took another step forward. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to." But he never finished. The store lights flickered once, twice, then buzzed violently before plunging the room into darkness. The emergency light near the register blinked on, dim and red, and in that flickering hue, she saw it. The man was gone, vanished without a sound. The clerk turned in a slow circle, panic blooming on his face. "Where? What the hell?" Then came the sound. A baby monitor crackling to life behind the counter. The sound of static filled the store, sharp and invasive in the dead quiet. She froze, her breath caught in her throat as the baby monitor crackled louder, like it had been placed directly beneath a microphone. The clerk spun toward the counter, where the sound emanated, his confusion warping into unease. "What the hell is that?" he asked. Voice hushed, now as if he too sensed something unnatural in the air. She didn't answer. Her body had gone rigid, muscles locking in place as her ears strained to catch every detail. The hiss of static faded for a brief moment. Then the breathing began, slow, measured, wet. Her stomach churned violently at the familiarity of it. She recognized that cadence, those ragged inhales echoing as if pulled through a throat too tight to let them pass cleanly. The sound wasn't coming from the back room. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from behind the counter. Inside the store with them, the clerk's hand hovered over the phone still in his grasp, but he didn't raise it again to his ear. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, nervously. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes remained fixed on the counter as a new sound joined the breathing. Faint whispers, unintelligible, yet intimate, curling through the air like smoke. Then came the knock. 3 soft raps against the front door of the store. The clerk flinched violently, nearly dropping the phone. She couldn't turn to look. She didn't have to. The knocks were deliberate, perfectly spaced, identical to the ones that had plagued her house. The sound vibrated through the glass pane, the reverberation making her teeth ache. She took a slow step back, her eyes darting to the door despite herself. Nothing, just the empty street outside, lit dimly by flickering fluorescent lights. But she knew, she could feel it. Whatever had followed her here was standing just beyond that glass, patient as ever. The clerk swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between her and the entrance. "Someone's out there," he said. Maybe they need help." He started toward the door and she lunged forward, grabbing his arm with a surprising strength, born of pure terror. "Don't," she whispered harshly. "Don't open it. Don't even go near it." The clerk shook his head, trying to free himself from her grip. "We can't just leave someone out there. What if they're hurt?" But her grip didn't falter. Her eyes burned with desperation as she hissed, "It's not a person." His face twisted in confusion, but he hesitated. Another knock came, slightly louder this time. Then another, and another. The rhythm never changed, precise and patient. The clerk's resistance waned as her fear sank into him like a contagion. He stepped back, his lips pressing into a tight line. Together they watched the door in silence. The knock stopped. The static from the monitor grew louder again. The whispers returned, overlapping in voices now dozens, maybe hundreds, all speaking in a chorus, too chaotic to comprehend. But one phrase repeated with haunting clarity, breaking through the babble. "Let me in." The words dripped with malice, yet the tone remained almost polite. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a request, one the speaker knew would eventually be granted. The clerk turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered. She couldn't answer. She didn't know herself. All she knew was that this thing didn't need the door open to get in. It never had. A sudden crash from the back of the store made them both jump. Something had toppled over. A display rack maybe, but neither of them had touched it. The clerk stumbled backward toward the counter, clutching the phone like a lifeline. We need to call the cops," he stammered. She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the monitor. The static had settled into a steady hum now, like a low, vibrating growl. Then she heard her name. It was barely more than a whisper, but the sound cut through her like a knife. It came from the monitor's speaker, soft and drawn out as if savoring each syllable. Her knees went weak, and she grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself. "How does it know my name?" she whispered, more to herself than to the clerk. The voice repeated it again, louder this time, a grotesque mimicry of human speech. Each time it spoke, it sounded closer, as though the speaker was moving steadily toward her. She felt her breath hitch in her throat, her lungs burning. The store lights flickered violently, buzzing with the sound of electricity straining to hold on. In one blink, everything was normal. In the next, she thought she saw a figure standing behind the counter, hunched low with impossibly long limbs reaching toward the monitor. Then the lights went out completely. The store plunged into darkness so thick it felt tangible, pressing against her skin. The clerk cursed loudly, fumbling with his phone to use its flashlight. But she didn't move. She was frozen, her eyes wide in the pitch-black room, straining for any sign of movement. A faint sound reached her ears, barely perceptible at first. Breathing, not hers, not the clerk's. It came from somewhere closer, between them. A soft inhale, then a long, rattling exhale. The clerk's phone finally illuminated the space, casting weak light over the racks of snacks and drinks. Nothing there, no sign of a figure. But the sound persisted, now accompanied by a faint scraping, like fingernails dragging along the linoleum floor. She pressed her back against the counter, her mind screaming at her to run, to move, to do anything but stand there. But her legs refused. Then from directly behind her, 3 knocks sounded against the counter. The knocks sent a shockwave through her, a sound so close it felt like it reverberated in her bones. She spun instinctively, her hands grasping for something, anything to defend herself. But the counter behind her was empty. No figure crouched there, no pale fingers drummed against the laminate surface. Yet she swore she'd felt the vibration of those knocks in her spine. The clerk's flashlight beam darted around the store like a trapped bird, flitting over racks and coolers but finding nothing. Did you hear that?" he stammered, his voice breaking as his knuckles whitened on the phone. She nodded stiffly, her lips too dry to form words, her ears strained in the silence that followed, waiting for a repeat of the sound. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a faint shift in the air, like a subtle exhale against her neck. She flinched violently, clutching at her throat as she stumbled backward. The clerk's light caught her face, revealing her wild, wide-eyed expression. "What is it?" he asked hoarsely. She shook her head. Her words faltered, as the monitor on the counter hissed again, louder than before. The static shifted, then resolved into a sound that made her stomach knot with terror. Breathing, slow, wet, closer now, much closer, as if the speaker had pressed their mouth directly against the microphone. The lights flickered back on with a harsh buzz. Both of them froze, blinking against the sudden fluorescence. Everything looked normal. The racks stood untouched. The doors remained closed, but the air felt heavier now, dense with the scent of damp earth and decay. She turned her eyes slowly toward the monitor. Its screen, cracked and dim, still glowed faintly. The breathing persisted, each inhale wet and rattling, each exhale a whisper of malice. The clerk crept forward, despite her sharp intake of breath. "Don't," she hissed. But he didn't stop. He reached for the monitor with tentative fingers, as though touching it might burn him. "It's just a baby monitor," he muttered, voice trembling. "Someone must be screwing with us. Maybe a radio signal, or some kind of..." He stopped cold. The static cut out, replaced by a single clear word. "Closer." The voice was low and guttural, yet unmistakably human, or at least, it tried to sound human. The syllables stretched unnaturally, warping at the edges like a corrupted recording. The clerk stumbled back, his face draining of color. The monitor hissed again. "Closer," it said, the word rising slightly in pitch. He shook his head violently. "No," he whispered, his back colliding with the candy rack. The monitor hissed louder, the voice repeating itself in a rising chant. "Closer, closer, closer." The lights flickered once more. She felt the air shift around them, a rush of cold so sharp it stole her breath. Then, from the far corner of the store, came the sound of fingers dragging slowly across the tile floor. The clerk's flashlight shot toward the sound. Nothing, just the shadowy aisle leading toward the back room. But the scraping continued, steady and deliberate. Her knees felt weak, her body swaying as though gravity itself had thickened. "It's coming in," she whispered, gripping the counter's edge to keep herself upright. The clerk's breathing grew louder, harsh and erratic. "What the hell does that mean?" he rasped. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the aisle, on the shadows pooling unnaturally at its mouth. Then, movement, a pale shape low to the floor, barely perceptible in the flickering light. It scuttled forward with a jerking, insect-like gait. The sound of dragging fingers grew louder, more insistent. The clerk cried out and backed toward her. "What is that?" The monitor spoke again, this time in a voice that made her blood run cold. "Let me hold you." It was soft, gentle, but the words coiled around her like a noose, promising something far worse than violence. The thing in the aisle moved again, faster this time, its limbs folding and unfolding in ways that defied human anatomy. She grabbed the clerk's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We have to go, now." He resisted for a heartbeat, frozen in horror, but the sight of the pale shape advancing finally broke him free. Together they ran, the sound of scuttling chasing them down the aisle. The front door loomed ahead, like salvation. She slammed her palm against the push bar, but the door refused to budge. Locked, the clerk slammed his shoulder into it, grunting with effort, but it held firm. Behind them, the monitor's voice deepened into a guttural growl. "Let me in." The glass of the door rattled violently, as if struck from the outside. They both screamed, recoiling instinctively. The clerk's flashlight fell to the floor and rolled, its beam spinning wildly across the store. The pale figure darted across its path, impossibly fast now, moving on all fours with spider-like precision. It was closer, so much closer. She grabbed the clerk's arm again, pulling him toward the back. "There has to be another way out," she shouted. He didn't argue. Their shoes squeaked against the tile as they ran for the stockroom. The air felt thicker back here, heavy with the scent of rot. Every fluorescent bulb flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows. She felt them press against her skin like hands, as if the darkness itself wanted to hold her in place. They reached the emergency exit at the far wall, but her heart sank instantly. The metal door had been chained shut from the outside. The clerk swore loudly, pounding his fists against it. The voice from the monitor echoed faintly down the aisle behind them. Nowhere to run. The clerk's fists pounded the emergency exit until his knuckles split, blood smearing the cold metal. The chains rattled with each blow, mocking their desperation. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath ragged, chest heaving like she'd run for miles. Behind them, the scuttling had stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thick and expectant. Her ears strained for the faintest sound, knowing it was still there, waiting. The clerk turned toward her, eyes wild, face pale and slick with sweat. "We're trapped," he gasped. "There's no way out." She shook her head violently, forcing her thoughts into some semblance of order. "Windows," she said, her voice hoarse. "There have to be windows in the stockroom." He scanned the walls, finding only narrow slits near the ceiling, too small for even her to squeeze through. She felt her stomach drop. Her thoughts fractured further when the baby monitor crackled again. This time, there was no static, no whispers, just breathing, loud, ragged, and impossibly close. She spun toward the aisle they had come from, her heart lodging in her throat. Something pale and twisted was crouched there, half hidden in shadow. The figure had unfolded itself from the darkness like an obscene spider, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Long fingers scraped lazily across the tile as its head cocked to one side, observing them. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. The scent of rot hit her again, stronger than ever, making her gag. The clerk's back pressed to hers, his voice a trembling whisper. What is that?" She couldn't answer. Words failed her as her eyes locked with its face, or what passed for one. Hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Lips cracked and bleeding as they mouthed silent words. Her skin prickled violently, every nerve screaming at her to run, even as her legs threatened to collapse beneath her. The thing tilted its head further, as if mocking their terror. Then, impossibly, it spoke. "Don't fight." The voice was low, guttural, yet deceptively calm. She clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head violently. "No," she whispered. "No, No, no. The monitor's speaker blared again, louder now, repeating the same words over and over in an escalating chant. Don't fight, don't fight, don't fight. The clerk clutched at his head with a strangled cry. The lights flickered violently, plunging them into alternating bursts of shadow and harsh white light. Each flicker brought the thing closer, first at the end of the aisle, then halfway across the room, then just beyond the stacks of boxed inventory. Her lungs burned as she forced her body into motion, grabbing the clerk's arm and dragging him toward the loading dock door. "Help me with this," she screamed. Together they yanked at the heavy roll-up door, but it refused to budge. The mechanism locked tight. Behind them, the creature's whisper grew louder. "You're already mine." The words felt like hooks sinking into her mind, dragging her thoughts into a cold, black void. She bit her tongue hard enough to draw blood, using the sharp pain to anchor herself. "Think," she hissed to the clerk. "Is there another door? A hatch? Something?" He shook his head wildly, panic overtaking reason. "There's nothing. Nowhere." Her eyes darted around the room, landing on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Without hesitation, she ripped it free, her hands trembling as she raised it high. "Stand back," she shouted. The clerk stumbled away as she hurled the heavy cylinder at the small stockroom window. The glass spider-webbed, but didn't shatter. She screamed in frustration, lifting the extinguisher again for another blow. The creature's breathing grew louder behind them, wet and eager, the sound of dragging fingers now joined by a grotesque chittering noise. She swung with every ounce of strength left in her. This time the window cracked open, shards raining down as cool night air rushed in. The opening was too small, but they didn't have a choice. "Go," she yelled, shoving the clerk toward it. He hesitated only a moment before scrambling awkwardly toward the narrow gap. She boosted him as best she could, the jagged glass slicing into her hands. "Hurry," she cried. He squeezed through, his legs kicking as he fell clumsily to the ground outside. "Come on," he shouted, his hands outstretched toward her. She turned to follow, but froze. The creature stood just feet away now, fully emerged from the shadows. Its limbs were too long, its frame impossibly thin, skin stretched taut over sharp bones. It smiled at her with that ruined mouth, cracked, teeth clicking softly as it whispered, "Stay." Her breath caught as an icy hand closed around her ankle. She screamed, kicking out wildly as she clawed for the window ledge. The clerk's hands gripped her wrists, pulling with all his strength. "I've got you. Come on." The thing's grip tightened, its nails biting through her skin. The pain was blinding, white hot, but she didn't let go. With one final desperate pull, the clerk yanked her through the gap. She tumbled onto the ground outside, glass and gravel digging into her flesh. The creature's arm shot through the window after her, pale fingers grasping wildly before retreating, as if burned by the night air. The monitor hissed one final time, "You can't run forever." Then silence. The night air stung her lungs as she stumbled forward, gravel digging into her palms and knees. Every breath was a ragged sob. But she didn't stop. Neither did the clerk. His arm was hooked beneath hers, half dragging her across the empty lot behind the store. The world beyond seemed eerily still, the silence pressing on them from all sides. Her ears strained for the slightest sound, the scuttling, the scraping, the wet breathing. But there was nothing, only their labored gasps and the faint crunch of their footsteps. The stockroom window yawned dark behind them like an open wound. She didn't dare glance back. It felt like if she looked too long, she might see pale fingers curling over the jagged edge again. We need to keep moving," the clerk panted, his voice shaking as much as his body. She nodded mutely, her own throat too raw to speak. Her hands throbbed with pain where glass had sliced her skin, and blood trickled down her wrists in warm streams. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when she felt the weight of unseen eyes still fixed on her back. They reached the edge of the lot where an overgrown alley stretched like a scar between two decrepit buildings. She hesitated, the shadows thick and unwelcoming, but the clerk gave her arm a desperate tug. "This way," he urged. "We can't stay in the open," she wanted to argue. Something about the alley felt wrong. Too quiet, too narrow, too easy for it to corner them again. But the sound of a faint knock echoed behind them, snapping her hesitation like brittle glass. 3 deliberate taps, so soft they might have been imagined. But she knew better. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her into the alley's darkness. The walls closed in around them, the air damp and heavy with mildew. Her bare feet stung with every step over broken glass and scattered debris. She focused on the clerk's broad shoulders ahead of her, the faint tremor in his movements betraying his own mounting terror. Halfway through they paused. He held up a hand signaling her to stop. Her breath hitched as she strained to listen, faintly, barely audible over their own panting. There was a sound, not knocking this time. Breathing. It came from ahead, low and wet, like lungs filled with water. She froze, her chest tight as her eyes darted wildly to the walls, the cracked pavement, the dumpsters looming like hulking shadows. "We can go around," she whispered, but the clerk shook his head. "No time," he hissed. "We're sitting ducks here." He pressed forward cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. She followed, each footfall sending sharp jolts of pain up her legs. The breathing grew louder, shifting locations as though whatever made the sound was circling them unseen. Her stomach twisted violently. The alley stretched ahead like a tunnel with no end. Then movement. A shadow detached itself from the wall ahead and unfolded, impossibly tall and thin. It stood motionless for a breathless moment, head cocked as if curious. She felt her knees threaten to buckle. The thing's proportions were all wrong, limbs too long, neck too bent. The suggestion of a mouth stretched far too wide. The clerk inhaled sharply and stumbled back into her. "Oh God," he whispered. The figure took one slow step forward, its joints creaking like old wood. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. It moved again, faster now, impossibly silent as it advanced. "Run," she gasped. They bolted, shoes and bare feet pounding over cracked pavement. The alley seemed to stretch, the exit receding no matter how fast they ran. Behind them came the sound of dragging fingers scraping walls as the creature gave chase at a steady, unhurried pace. The sound alone made her vision blur with terror. Her lungs screamed for air as they burst into an open street, the sudden light of a street lamp making her stumble to a halt. The clerk doubled over, wheezing violently, his hands gripping his knees. She spun in a frantic circle, scanning every shadow. Nothing, no sound. The alley yawned behind them, black and empty. But she knew it wasn't gone. "It's toying with us," she whispered. The clerk straightened, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice cracking. She tried to think, but her mind felt like static. Home wasn't an option. The store was lost. She needed somewhere safe, somewhere it couldn't get in. But the memory of its voice, soft and calm, echoed in her mind. You can't run forever. Her chest tightened painfully as a horrifying thought took root. What if there wasn't anywhere safe? What if it had already marked her, followed her so deeply into her life that nowhere was beyond its reach? She rubbed at her raw, bleeding hands, trying to anchor herself in the sting of the cuts. "We need light," she said finally. "Somewhere bright, crowded." She wasn't sure if that would make a difference, but it felt better than standing still. The clerk nodded stiffly. Together they started down the street, their steps quick but unsteady. The silence pressed close again, the world around them unnaturally still. As they passed a row of dark houses, she felt it, a prickle at the base of her neck, the electric certainty of being watched. She turned her head slowly, her heart in her throat. For an instant she swore she saw it, a pale face in an upstairs window, staring down at her with hollow sockets. But when she blinked, the window was empty. She swallowed hard and forced her legs to keep moving. Then the sound came again, 3 soft knocks, this time from the door of the house beside them.
They didn't knock. Neither of them had touched the door. She stared at it, heart slamming against her ribs, breath stuck behind clenched teeth. The house before them was dark. No porch light, no flicker of movement inside. But the sound had been unmistakable. 3 gentle raps, calm, intentional. Her knees weakened as she took a step back, almost tripping on the curb. The clerk turned toward her, pale and breathless. "That wasn't us," he whispered. She could barely nod, her ears strained in the silence that followed. No cars, no footsteps, just wind. But even that felt wrong, still, muffled, like the night itself was listening. "It's playing," she muttered. "It's doing this on purpose." The clerk rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself, though the air was humid. "Why that house?" he asked. She didn't know, but her eyes lingered on the windows. They stared back at her like empty eyes. She had seen something up there before, hadn't she? A pale face, watching. And now there were knocks. No footsteps, no shadow in the yard, just knocks. Her body screamed to run, but her mind couldn't move. There was something new in her terror now. Recognition, not of the house, but of the pattern. It didn't matter where she went. Something always knocked. The clerk finally turned away. "We keep walking," he said, his voice firmer now. "We don't stop." She followed, feet dragging like anchors. But as they passed the next house, the same sound echoed behind them again. 3 soft knocks, this time from a different door. She didn't turn around, couldn't, but her spine prickled with icy certainty. It was behind them, following, knocking, always knocking. She grabbed the clerk's arm. "Faster," she whispered. They began to jog, their footsteps hurried and uneven on the cracked pavement. Every few seconds, another knock rang out from a different house, sometimes from a side door, sometimes from a garage. One time, impossibly, from the sewer grate at their feet. It was absurd, unreal, and yet constant. The world remained dead around them. No lights flicked on, no one stepped outside. It was like they were the only 2 souls left in the city, stalked by something patient enough to wear them down knock by knock. Her legs ached, lungs burning, and still it came. Tap, tap. By the time they reached the gas station again, dawn had begun to bleed faint light into the sky. The windows of the station were dark now. A strip of yellow police tape fluttered across the door. She froze. The clerk cursed under his breath. The interior had been gutted, shelves knocked over, glass shattered, dark stains on the floor. They stared in silence for a long moment.
"Someone came," she whispered, "after we escaped." But there was no comfort in that. The tape meant the police had found something. Probably not enough. Maybe a body. Maybe nothing at all. She knew in her gut the creature hadn't left behind evidence that made sense. The kind of terror it inflicted didn't show up well on reports. The clerk stepped forward, fingers grazing the police tape like he couldn't believe it was real. "They won't believe us," he said quietly. "No one will." She didn't argue. She knew he was right. Her eyes lifted to the shattered window where they'd escaped. Glass still hung in jagged teeth. The monitor was gone, no sign of it. That terrified her more than if it had still been there. "Come on," she said. "We need to find someplace new, somewhere with cameras, people, light." The clerk didn't move for a moment. Then he nodded. They walked, slower now. Their adrenaline had burned away, leaving only exhaustion and dread in its wake. The rising sun painted everything in shades of ash and bone. Even in daylight, the world felt off, too quiet, too pale. She expected the knocks to stop with the morning, but they didn't. They changed, became subtler. Instead of audible raps, she began noticing subtle disturbances, papers shifting when there was no wind, drawers slightly open, a wall clock resetting its time by a few minutes. Always 3 minutes. 3. Always 3. The clerk noticed them too. He'd stop suddenly in the street, eyes locked on a darkened window or a bench that wasn't empty a moment before. "I think it's learning," he said once. "Learning how to stay invisible in the light." The idea made her physically ill. By mid-morning, they found an old 24-hour laundromat. There were no attendants, just flickering fluorescent lights, humming machines, and a single broken vending machine rattling occasionally on its own. But it was open. It had cameras. It had light. It was enough. For now. She collapsed into a plastic chair and let her head fall into her hands. The clerk paced, occasionally peeking out the glass door like he expected to see a pale figure crawling across the asphalt. "We need a plan," he muttered. She didn't respond. Her ears were ringing again. She pressed her palms to her temples, trying to silence the phantom static. It never really left her anymore. "It's not just a ghost," she said softly. "It's not a demon, either." The clerk looked up. "Then what is it?" She looked toward the spinning dryer drum. Her reflection walked in the glass. "It's attention. It's focus. It's something you don't want to notice you." And now it had noticed them both. She stood, moving toward the laundromat's office. The door was locked, but she found a key taped behind the fire extinguisher. Inside, a dusty monitor displayed grainy camera feeds. She watched herself and the clerk from above, grainy and small. She stared at the hallway view, the parking lot, the back entrance. She watched for 20 straight minutes. Nothing moved. Then on the rear camera, 3 knocks, clear, on the glass. But there was no one outside. She saw nothing. Yet the door flexed from the impact. She felt bile rise in her throat. The clerk joined her at the monitor, his face drained of blood. They watched together. No movement, no shadow, only the glass rippling slightly from something that wasn't there. She backed away. "We can't stay here either," she said. "It found us."
The laundromat felt smaller with each passing second. The humming dryers, the fluorescent lights. They didn't comfort her anymore. They felt oppressive, artificial, like a fragile illusion that could snap at any moment. The clerk stood at the glass front, his silhouette motionless against the brightness outside. She watched him for a while, trying to quiet the pounding in her chest. "We can't stay here," she whispered again.
but the words felt heavy, like they were dragging her down. He didn't answer. His hands were pressed against the glass, fingertips whitening, as though holding the door closed with sheer willpower. She followed his gaze but saw nothing. No pale figure, no movement, just the empty lot beyond, sun-scorched and still. But she felt it, that sensation of a gaze anchored to the back of her skull. The sound of static teased her ears, faint but constant now. She rubbed her temples hard enough to hurt. "It's not leaving," she murmured. "It's everywhere we go." The clerk finally spoke, his voice hollow. "It's worse than that." He turned toward her, eyes glassy and distant. "It's inside." For a moment she thought he meant inside the laundromat. Her heart stuttered violently as her eyes darted toward the shadowy corners. Under the folding tables, the bathroom door cracked slightly ajar. But his meaning sank in when he pressed a trembling hand to his chest. "Inside us," he said. "We're carrying it now." She shook her head violently. "No," she snapped. "It's following. That's all. We just have to keep moving." Her voice lacked conviction. Deep down she knew he wasn't wrong. It wasn't just pursuing them anymore. It was sinking into them. She felt it in her dreams, heard it in the faint clicking of her teeth, saw it in the subtle twitch of her hands. It was like a sickness taking root, growing stronger each time she tried to deny it. The knocking came again, this time from the laundromat's front glass. 3 perfect raps, loud enough to make the panels shiver in their frames. She flinched back, a choked scream caught in her throat. The clerk stumbled too, but neither of them approached the door. There was nothing outside, no figure, no movement, just the knock. The sound came again, softer, almost playful. She backed toward the office, her mind fracturing into static as the knocks began moving. 3 at the front, 3 at the side door, 3 at the back entrance. It was circling, testing. She fumbled for the door's lock, but her fingers were too slick with sweat to grip properly. The clerk's breathing quickened until it was a rasping pant. He pressed himself to the office wall, eyes wide and unblinking. "It's already here," he whispered. "It doesn't need a door." His words were punctuated by another knock. This one came from the ceiling above them. Her stomach dropped as she tilted her head back. The office ceiling tiles were old and cracked, a few slightly misaligned. Dust drifted down lazily, as though disturbed by movement above. Her vision tunneled. The clerk grabbed her arm suddenly, snapping her back to focus. "We have to go," he hissed. "Out the back, now." She nodded numbly, too paralyzed to argue. Together they crept into the main room, the humming machine suddenly deafening in the stillness. The knocking continued in sporadic bursts, now from the windows, now from the vents. It was all around them, a constant reminder that they were boxed in. They reached the rear exit, a battered metal door with a push bar. The clerk pressed it gently, and to their relief, it swung open with a reluctant creak. The outside air was suffocating. It should have been freeing. Sunlight, open space. But it wasn't. The lot behind the laundromat was empty, except for scattered trash and an overturned shopping cart. Yet the oppressive sense of being watched never left. She kept her back to the building as they edged away, her eyes scanning every shadow. They didn't speak. Even their footsteps seemed too loud. The clerk's eyes darted toward the tree line at the edge of the lot. "There," he murmured. "We can cut through." She wanted to protest. The trees looked thick and dark even under the noonday sun, but the thought of staying in the open, exposed, felt worse. She followed. The woods swallowed them quickly, the air cooling as the canopy thickened overhead. Twigs snapped beneath their feet, each sound amplified in the heavy silence. She felt the static again, a faint hum beneath her skin like ants crawling through her veins. Her breath caught as a memory surfaced. Her bedroom closet, the baby monitor, that first night of ragged breathing. It felt like years ago now, but it hadn't ended there. It hadn't left her since. "We're not escaping," she said softly. The clerk glanced back at her, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "We have to keep trying," he said. "We don't just give up." She wanted to agree. She wanted to believe. But the hum in her skull only grew louder. Then it spoke, a voice low and rasping, curling through the trees like smoke. "Found you." The voice slithered through the trees so close it felt like it vibrated in her skull. She stumbled, catching herself against a moss-slick trunk as her chest heaved. The clerk froze mid-step, his head snapping toward the sound. "No," he whispered, shaking his head violently. "No, no, no." But the voice came again, soft yet echoing from all directions at once. "Don't run. Stay." She felt her stomach knot violently as a rush of cold air brushed her neck. Her legs obeyed before her mind could, pushing her forward in a clumsy sprint deeper into the forest. The clerk followed, his footfalls heavy and erratic behind her. Branches whipped against her face and arms, the sting of fresh cuts grounding her panic. The static in her head roared now, nearly drowning out her own frantic heartbeat. She couldn't tell if the sound came from the creature or from inside her. Maybe both. She wanted to scream, but her throat locked tight. The knocking started again. First from a tree to their left, 3 sharp raps that sent a murder of crows bursting skyward. Then from the ground beneath their feet. Then from the air itself, impossibly close, as though invisible knuckles tapped against her eardrums. She clamped her hands over her ears and kept running, her lungs on fire. The world seemed to twist around her, trees bending at impossible angles, shadows writhing like living things. "It's not real," she whispered through gritted teeth. "It's not real." But the voice answered her thoughts directly. "It's real. More real than you." Her vision blurred with tears as she burst into a small clearing. Sunlight spilled weakly through the canopy, painting the grass in pale gold. For a fleeting moment, she thought they'd made it. But then she saw it. The baby monitor. It sat upright in the center of the clearing, battered and cracked, its tiny red light blinking steadily. A faint hiss leaked from its speaker. She froze, unable to take another step. The clerk nearly slammed into her from behind. "What?" he began, but stopped dead when he saw it. The static deepened, rising to a low rumble that made her teeth ache. Then, layered over the hiss, came breathing, slow, ragged, wet. She felt the sound vibrating in her ribcage, like a second heartbeat. Then a voice. "I'm waiting." The words oozed from the monitor, warped and metallic yet horribly clear. Her body shook, as if she'd been dropped in ice water. "We can't touch it," she whispered. "Don't go near it." The clerk didn't answer. She turned to see his eyes glassy and unfocused, his body swaying slightly. "No," she hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't listen." But his lips moved soundlessly, repeating the words he heard. "I'm waiting." She shook him violently, her nails digging into his skin. "Fight it," she screamed. His head jerked, his pupils shrinking suddenly, as though he'd surfaced from deep water. He stumbled back, dragging her with him. The monitor's speaker crackled louder. "You're almost ready." Her stomach churned as a shadow fell across the clearing. Not from the trees, from something impossibly tall, its shape stretching and bending around the light like heat haze. She couldn't see it fully, but she felt it. The clerk gasped. "It's here," he rasped. The thing moved closer, each step silent, but heavy enough to make the ground tremble. She backed away slowly, her breath hitching on each inhale. The creature didn't rush. It didn't need to. She could feel its attention like a weight pressing into her skull. Her vision darkened at the edges, static crawling inward. Soon, the voice promised. Her legs gave out. She fell to her knees, her hands trembling violently. The clerk grabbed her shoulders, trying to pull her upright. "We can't stay here," he hissed, but her body refused to obey. She was so tired, so heavy, so a sharp sound broke through her fog. Knocking, 3 hard raps, this time from her own chest. Her eyes flew open. She screamed. The clerk yanked her upright and dragged her bodily from the clearing. She stumbled alongside him, sobbing uncontrollably. The knocking continued, against her ribs, against her spine, as if her body had become its door. "Stop," she screamed. "Get out, get out." The sound faded as they burst from the trees into an open field. The sunlight here was stronger, the air cleaner. For a moment, the weight on her chest lessened. She collapsed into the grass, clutching her torso, as if to crush whatever still lingered there. The clerk knelt beside her, his face drawn and pale. "It's inside us now," he whispered. She shook her head violently, but deep down she knew he was right. The monitor's voice echoed faintly from the tree line behind them. "Next time, I'll bring the door." The field stretched endlessly, but even the open sky brought no comfort. She lay on her back in the coarse grass, clutching her chest, as if holding something inside that was desperate to get out. Each breath rattled in her throat, shallow and uneven. The clerk sat a few feet away, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, staring at nothing. The morning sun beat down on them both, but it felt dim somehow, like a distant bulb behind a dirty pane of glass. She wanted to speak, to say something that might anchor them back to the world they'd known before, the world of work shifts and errands and unremarkable nights. But the words wouldn't come. Her voice was trapped beneath the static that still hissed faintly in her skull. It had been hours since they'd fled the woods. No more knocks, no more whispers, but that absence felt like a trap, a quiet breath before the next scream. Her raw hands pressed tighter to her ribs. Every now and then she thought she felt it again, the faintest echo of knuckles tapping against her bones. "We can't go back," the clerk said suddenly, his voice dry and cracked. His gaze never shifted from the horizon. Not to the store, not to the laundromat, not home. There's nowhere. She didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because she didn't have the strength to. Her home felt like a place from a different life, distant and unreachable. Yet part of her, the stubborn, desperate part, clung to the idea of walls and doors and locks, as if they could still matter. "We have to find someone," she said finally. Her words felt weak, even to her own ears. "Police, a church, someone." The clerk shook his head violently. "They can't stop it. You saw, you know what it is." She flinched. She hated how certain he sounded, how easily he had accepted it. And yet, hadn't she felt the same thing creeping into her thoughts? "It's not even chasing us anymore," he whispered. "It doesn't have to." Her body tensed as a faint sound reached her ears. Not knocking, not breathing, laughter. It was soft and childlike, floating on the breeze like a taunt. Her head jerked toward the tree line, her heart thundering painfully. Nothing moved among the branches, but she couldn't shake the image of the baby monitor in the clearing, the pale light blinking like a predator's eye. She struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain that shot up her legs. "We can't stay here," she said. Her voice shook, but she forced strength into it. The clerk's eyes snapped to her, wide and glassy. For a moment she thought he might argue. Then he nodded once and rose unsteadily. Together they set off, their steps slow and uneven as they trudged toward the distant shape of buildings on the horizon. As they walked, the world seemed to warp subtly around them. Houses appeared too quickly, streets leading nowhere. Every few blocks, the same corner store reappeared, its sign flickering, its windows boarded. She counted 3 identical gas stations before she stopped trying. The air grew heavier, harder to draw into her lungs. Her mind felt sluggish, like she was wading through syrup. Once they passed a parked car, where a baby monitor sat propped on the dashboard. Its tiny speaker hissed softly as they passed, though the car's windows were up and the doors locked. She looked away quickly, bile rising in her throat. The clerk grabbed her arm. His grip was tight, fingers trembling. "It's not the world," he rasped. "It's us. We're carrying it forward." His words barely made sense, but she couldn't deny the truth in his tone. They found a motel by late afternoon. The neon sign sputtered weakly. Vacancy. Every window was drawn shut, curtains heavy and still. No cars in the lot, no clerk at the front desk. She stepped inside cautiously, the air thick with the scent of mildew. The clerk followed, his hand hovering near her shoulder like he was afraid to lose her in the shadows. The desk bell sat on the counter, untouched. She didn't ring it. Instead, she slid behind the counter and plucked a key off the wall. Room 6, a single queen bed. It didn't matter. Anywhere with a lock would do. As they entered the room, she flicked the light switch, half expecting nothing to happen. To her relief, the bulb above flickered to life, pale and humming. She closed the door, engaging every lock. For the first time in hours, she let out a shaky breath. They sat in silence, on opposite sides of the bed. The clerk cradled his head in his hands, rocking slightly. She stared at the floor, her mind running blank, except for one thought. What if it's already here? That thought was answered almost immediately. From the nightstand came a faint hiss. Her head snapped toward it. A baby monitor sat there, battered and cracked, its red light blinking steadily. It hadn't been there when they entered. Chapter 5, Part 2. The red light blinked like a heartbeat, steady, patient, impossibly loud in the silence of the motel room. She stared at it from her spot on the bed, unable to move. Her hands gripped the blanket so tightly, her knuckles whitened. "It wasn't there," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The clerk's breathing quickened. He turned his head slowly toward the nightstand, his face slack with horror. "We didn't bring it," he murmured. His words felt as heavy as a verdict. Neither of them moved closer. The monitor hissed softly, static crackling in uneven bursts. Then came a sound layered beneath the white noise breathing. Wet, ragged, familiar. Her stomach lurched violently as she clamped a hand over her mouth. The breathing shifted, faster, louder, until it felt like it was filling the entire room. The walls seemed to close in with each exhale. She thought she saw them flex slightly, like lungs drawing air. The clerk stumbled to his feet. "We have to smash it," he said, his voice tight with panic. She grabbed his arm instinctively. "Don't," she hissed. "You don't know what happens if—" Her warning came too late. He grabbed the monitor and hurled it against the wall with a scream. The plastic casing shattered, batteries rolling across the carpet. The speaker cracked open, wires spilling like veins. The hissing cut off instantly, plunging the room into suffocating silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. She felt her heart pound painfully in her throat. Maybe, just maybe, it had worked. Then came the knock. 3 hard raps, so loud they made the headboard shiver. Her body went rigid. The sound had come from inside the room. She turned her head with agonizing slowness toward the closet. Its door stood slightly ajar, a darkness within darker than the rest of the room. The air grew thick, heavy, as if they were standing underwater. The clerk backed against the window, his eyes locked on the narrow opening. "It's in here," he breathed. She nodded once, unable to speak. The silence dragged out, taut as a wire. Then came a second knock. Louder this time. The closet door trembled slightly. She saw fingers, a pale hand curling around the edge of the door, its nails cracked and blackened. "Don't fight," whispered a voice from within. The door creaked wider. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the carpet. The clerk bolted toward the bathroom, yanking her arm so hard she nearly fell. He slammed the bathroom door shut and locked it, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The light above them flickered violently. The pipes groaned as if something enormous was crawling through them. She pressed her back to the tiled wall, her pulse a wild drum beat. "Stay quiet," she mouthed. A faint knock echoed from the bathroom mirror. 3 soft raps. She felt tears burn her eyes as the clerk's hand clamped over his mouth. The knock came again, this time from beneath the sink, then from the ceiling vent, then from the door. Always 3, always closer. The static hiss returned, barely audible at first, but growing until it seemed to seep from the grout between the tiles. "It's not outside anymore," she whispered. "It's inside the room, inside us." The clerk's eyes darted wildly, his lips moving soundlessly in prayer. The static built to a crescendo before cutting off. "Suddenly, open the door," the voice whispered. The bathroom door rattled as though struck by a giant's fist. She screamed, clutching the clerk's arm, as the light bulb burst with a sharp pop. Glass rained down in tiny glittering shards. Darkness swallowed them whole.
The bathroom's darkness clung to her like a second skin, thick and suffocating. She could feel the clerk's trembling hand still gripping hers, his fingernails digging crescents into her palm. A faint static, his oozed from above, filling the air with a low, droning hum that made her teeth ache. Every breath felt too loud, her lungs working against the silence with a traitorous rasp. She tried to focus on the tiles beneath her feet, counting the tiny cracks in their grout lines, but her vision wavered, the cracks seeming to shift and realign in impossible patterns. The hiss deepened, becoming a sound she almost recognized, a wet, ragged breathing that didn't belong to either of them. Her stomach lurched. She pressed a hand over her mouth, willing herself not to make a sound. The clerk's face was a pale smear in the dark, his lips moving in frantic silence. She wanted to tell him to stop, to tell him that praying didn't help when the thing wasn't listening. But before she could, a new sound joined the static. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. They didn't come from the door. They came from the mirror. She didn't want to look. Every part of her screamed not to. But her eyes betrayed her, dragging toward the faint, warped reflection. And there it was, a pale silhouette pressed against the glass, its face smooth and featureless. Its hand lifted slowly,
fingers cracking like brittle twigs as it tapped once, twice, 3 times more. The sound of knuckles rapping glass echoed like gunshots in the small room, each knock vibrating through her bones. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard, she thought it might crack them. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will the image away, but she could still feel it, the pressure of that gaze without eyes, the weight of its presence pressing down like 1,000 hands. The mirror groaned, glass stretching and warping, as if something massive was trying to force its way through. The clerk whimpered beside her, a strangled sound that made her chest clench. She grabbed his arm, shaking him hard. "Don't look," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Don't you dare." But he was already staring, his wide eyes locked on the mirror's surface. It's coming out," he whispered hoarsely. She didn't want to believe him, but the sound of splintering glass confirmed what her gut already knew. A spiderweb crack spread across the mirror as a long, pale arm pushed through, its joints bending at impossible angles. The fingers flexed once, twice, before pressing flat against the tile wall, leaving wet, smeared prints behind. She yanked the clerk toward the door, her nails biting into his skin. The air had turned hot and fetid, thick with the stench of rot. Her lungs burned as she stumbled forward, each breath shallow and ragged. "We have to move," she gasped. "Now." But the mirror's voice followed them, low and guttural, almost there. They burst out of the bathroom, their bodies colliding with the motel room's stale air like swimmers breaking the surface. Light poured in through the open curtains, but it wasn't the comforting warmth of day. The sunlight felt wrong, cold and pale, like a fluorescent bulb trying to imitate the sun. She froze, her breath catching painfully in her chest. Outside, the parking lot was full now, every space occupied by the same faded blue sedan, lined up in perfect rows. Their windshields were opaque, black as obsidian, and she felt sure that if she stared too long, she would see something staring back. The clerk stumbled past her, clutching his head with both hands. "It's not real," he muttered under his breath, over and over like a mantra. But the words didn't help. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, charged with static. Her gaze snapped to the nightstand. The baby monitor sat there once again, whole and unbroken, its tiny red light blinking like a watchful eye. Her stomach turned violently. "No," she whispered. "No. No, no." She stepped back, her heel catching on the threadbare carpet. But the monitor hissed louder, and beneath it came that breathing again, closer this time, louder, like it was right beside her ear. The clerk spun to face the closet as 3 sharp knocks rang out from within. She flinched violently, her back hitting the motel door with a dull thud. The sound wasn't just audible, it resonated in her chest cavity, her ribcage humming with each impact. "It's here," the clerk whispered hoarsely. His voice cracked as another knock answered from under the bed. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Then from the bathroom door they'd fled moments ago. Then from the ceiling directly above. The overlapping rhythms merged into an awful cacophony, a percussive heartbeat that seemed to rattle the walls. She pressed her palms to her ears, but the sound was inside her head now, bypassing flesh and bone. Her vision blurred as her knees buckled beneath her. She clutched her chest, feeling the echo of knocks against her ribcage, faint but insistent. "It's not outside anymore," she gasped. It's in us." The clerk's eyes darted wildly, his lips still moving soundlessly. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to snap out of it, but her own mouth wouldn't obey. The monitor's hiss grew louder, rising to a deafening roar before breaking into words. Almost time. Her stomach lurched as the voice slithered across her thoughts like oil. It wasn't coming from the monitor. It was inside. She felt its words vibrate in her teeth, its cold amusement curling in her gut like a parasite. "You've brought me so far," it whispered. "Now let me in." She shook her head violently, clawing at her temples. "Get out," she rasped. "You're not real." But the knocks only grew louder, faster, until they blended into a single pounding drumbeat. The air shimmered, the walls bowing inward, as if the room itself were breathing. She could smell it now, a sickly sweet odor like rotting fruit and wet earth. Her eyes darted to the door, but it was gone. There was only a blank wall where the exit had been. Panic surged hot and sharp in her veins. "It's changing the room," she cried. We're not in the motel anymore." The clerk staggered to his knees, clutching his head and sobbing. The voice laughed softly, low and wet. "Nowhere left to run."
The walls pulsed faintly, their surface rising and falling like the slow, deliberate breaths of a sleeping animal. She pressed herself against the corner of the room, nails digging into the peeling wallpaper until her fingertips burned. The air had grown so thick she could taste it, bitter and metallic, like the tang of blood in her mouth. The clerk was crouched a few feet away, his body curled in on itself as though trying to disappear. His shoulders jerked with every knock that reverberated through the space, each sound impossibly close and impossibly loud. The knocks weren't just in the walls anymore. They came from beneath the floor, from the air itself, from inside her own chest. She pressed her hand to her sternum and felt it there, 3 deliberate taps against her ribs. Panic coiled in her gut, like a living thing. "It's inside," she whispered, voice raw. "It's already inside." The monitor on the nightstand hissed louder, the red light blinking faster now, strobing like an alarm. The creature's voice seeped through the static, wet and guttural, almost open. She shut her eyes tight, rocking back and forth, as if motion alone could keep her tethered to the world she once knew. But when she opened them again, the room had changed. The walls had melted into an endless expanse of black, a void that swallowed light whole. The floor beneath her feet no longer felt solid. Each breath she took seemed to echo unnaturally, as though she were exhaling into a cavernous, unseen space. She could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, slow and deliberate, each plink slicing through the thick silence like a blade. The clerk's sobs had quieted. She turned her head and saw him standing now, his back to her. But something was wrong. His outline wavered, edges fraying like a photograph left too long in the sun. "We're not supposed to be here," she managed to rasp, though her voice sounded muffled, as though coming from underwater. He didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hands to his head and began clawing at his scalp with shaking fingers. Strands of hair came away in his hands, skin too. She screamed, the sound thin and weak in the vast black. The figure turned slightly, and she realized with gut-wrenching clarity that it wasn't him anymore. The smooth, featureless face she'd seen in the mirror stared back at her, its eyeless gaze cutting straight through her skin. "Let me in," it whispered, not aloud, but directly into her thoughts. Then came the knock, 3 heavy blows against her skull, so forceful they nearly sent her to her knees. She clutched her head, fingers tangling in her hair, as tears streamed hot and unchecked down her face. "No," she croaked. "Get out. You don't belong here."
but the creature's voice curled around her words like smoke. "You brought me here. I was invited." Her mind reeled, grasping at memories that felt slippery and incomplete. She saw herself fumbling with the baby monitor the night of the first knock, whispering the words without thought. "Come in," she choked on a sob as realization bloomed cold in her chest. "I didn't mean it," she said weakly. The creature's laugh was low and wet, reverberating through the black void. "Words are doors," it murmured, "and doors open both ways." The floor rippled beneath her, a hand-shaped protrusion pressing upward from beneath, as though something enormous was trying to push through. She scrambled backward, her palms scraping across the warped surface. The baby monitor blinked red in the darkness. Its speaker crackled with a burst of static, so loud it made her flinch. Then came the sound, breathing, ragged and greedy, as if the creature had lungs now and was learning how to use them. The voice followed, softer than before, but no less horrifying. "It's warm in here," it sighed. "So close, so easy." Her heart hammered painfully as she realized what it meant. It wasn't speaking of the room, it was speaking of her body. "No," she whispered again, shaking violently. She could feel the faintest sensation of fingers brushing the insides of her skull, curling gently, as though testing their new home. "You'll be so much quieter," the creature cooed. "No more running, no more fear, just one heartbeat. Ours." She pressed her palms to her temples and screamed. The sound fractured the blackness for a moment, a thin crack of pale light slicing across the void. She lunged for it instinctively, her hands clawing at the fissure until it widened. The motel room returned in a sickening rush. She collapsed to the floor, chest heaving as the carpet's coarse fibers dug into her skin. The clerk lay sprawled nearby, his body twitching slightly, as though caught in some invisible current. The monitor sat whole and undisturbed on the nightstand, its red light blinking slowly now, patiently. She could still hear the creature's breathing through it, steady and calm, as though it was waiting for her to break.
And that was just the beginning. If the knocking ever starts at your door, remember words are doors too, and some doors should never be opened. But what happens when the knocking doesn't stop? When the baby monitor blinks red in your own home, the full story gets darker, deeper, and far more terrifying than anything we've seen so far. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now for more chilling stories, disturbing history, and haunting mysteries that will keep you awake long after the video ends. Turn on notifications, because the next knock could come sooner than you think.